You ready? All right, let's go. Well, with a little technical difficulty, our AV team has solved the problem, and we are back with a wonderful presentation here at Friendly House. Our folks on Zoom and our folks here at Friendly House want to welcome you all to the Humanists of Greater Portland's Sunday morning meeting. My name is Helen Christians. I'll be your MC this morning, and so very glad that you're here. Our meeting today will be recorded and available to the general public. HGP believes strongly in freedom of speech, but the views expressed by myself, today's reader, today's speaker, HGP members, and our guests today's meeting are not the official views of the Humanists of Greater Portland. You are at a humanist meeting, and just as a quick definition, humanism is a non-theist philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists use reason and empathy to live meaningful and ethical lives because the life we are leading is precious and the only life of which we are certain. As humanists, we affirm the dignity and worth of all people and recognize the importance of cooperation among people simply for the possibility for peace and well-being when humans interact with respect for one another. Joyce is our reader this morning. Come on in, Joyce.
The reading is from Judith Viorst's most recent book, Making the Best of What's Left. From the jacket, now in her 90s and in the shadow of her husband's recent death, Viorst offers an exhilarating meditation on final chapters, how to grasp the richness and grace that remains even as much slips away. Sometimes humorous and sometimes poignant, one of the questions she addresses is the ideal afterlife. Although I don't believe in it, my hopes for an afterlife include the divine as well as the everyday, which means that in addition to hanging out with heavenly hosts and hostesses, plus an assortment of other celestial beings, I'd spend eternity with the people I love and never see those I could spend forever not seeing. Particularly, and please check the attached list, my sister-in-law. Although I'm not expecting it, my plans for an afterlude include the profound as well as the frivolous, which means that in addition to grasping the ultimate nature of good and evil, plus how much of life is free will and how much is fate, I'll be able to play the piano without taking lessons, eat whatever I want without gaining weight, and get to have sex with Paul Newman without feeling guilty. Although I wouldn't count on it, my goals for an afterlife include the sublime as well as the down-to-earth, which means that in addition to purging my heart of sin and my soul of envy, plus ridding my spirit of selfishness and despair, I'd concede that my friend Irene is better at Scrabble, admit that I haven't quite mastered learning to share, and get over the fact that Fran Tepper, who, let me tell you, doesn't deserve this, is married to someone who worships the ground she walks on. Although I'm not disputing it. My views of an afterlife include the devout as well as the dubious, which means that in addition to my awe at the magnificence of creation, I'm wondering what the creators were thinking about when they decided, for instance, to make mosquitoes. And weren't there any better options than death? And why give a chronic skin disease to a darling person like Marilyn and a perfect complexion to a bitch like Beth? And why leave us never knowing, never ever for sure really knowing if there is an afterlife?
Joyce, that was lovely and funny and just perfect for today. Thank you so much. All right. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Gordon Orians, who will be joining us over Zoom from Seattle, Washington. This gentleman has a Wikipedia page, folks, so we are really quite fortunate to have him here. And when I did a little looking because he put he's been with us many times. He's presented many times in the past. So our new member form, the speakers are supposed to put in like a little bit about themselves so that the MC can read this thing. In his, he said, "I've been there enough, you know." I've been there enough, you know me. I thought, oh no, I got to figure out what all these wonderful things he's done. So these are all the wonderful things he's done. A longtime leader in the environmental sciences, Dr. Gordon Orians, who has been inducted into both the National Academy of Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, served 10 years as the director of the University of Washington Institute for Environmental Studies. During his 35 years as UW Professor of Zoology, Dr. Orians conducted extensive research into the complex and often delicate relationships that exist between ecology and animal social organization and behaviors. His research has shed much light on the habitat selection, male selection and mating systems, selection of prey and foraging patches, and plant-herbivore interactions. Dr. Orians now serves as Professor Emeritus of Biology at the University of Washington. He will be discussing today the complexity of making a decision on whether to pursue and capture a potential prey or wait for another that might arrive. Gordon, thanks so much for joining us again. You will have enlightened us many times and before, and we're looking forward to what you have to say today. Welcome.
Thank you for this wonderful introduction. It's always a pleasure to come here. Slight deviation, going back to what Joyce said, I'm reminded of the little quip. What did Beethoven do in his grave? Decompose. Anyway, the talk I'm about to share with you, I gave here in Seattle in the Let's Talk Science arena. And you might wonder, what's this got to do with secular humanists? Well, I hope to show you that what it has to do with secular humanists is the basic understanding of this wonderful and strange thing we call science is terribly important as a part of becoming a pure and informed secular humanist. So this talk is actually in part a personal odyssey for me because I'm talking about a field in which I have been very active in making contributions. And it also reveals the complexities that are involved in this. So I hope to convince you, but may find out otherwise in the Q&A afterwards, that this is really something to do with secular humanists. So let's proceed with pursue or not to pursue.
There was a Scotsman, McGill, who used to watch birds on the rill, but he would have nothing to do with the puffin, for look at the size of its bill. And I think one of the most familiar scenes to people that don't know anything about birds is the picture of a puffin with that marvelous bill and with several fish in it. And this puffin has been out foraging, but it's not been out foraging for itself. It is coming back because it's been foraging to bring back food for a chick in the burrow. And this picture was probably taken when it's landed and about to go into the burrow to feed its chicks. And this is an aspect of foraging which we call central place foraging, where the object is bringing back food to a particular place, and this is true of birds with nestling. And if you watch bees out foraging or gathering all that pollen, they're not feeding themselves, they're bringing it back to the hive. And so I'll come back to that issue of central place foraging because it's a rather interesting one. But before I do, I want to leave you with a question. How does the puffin get second and third fish without dropping the fish it already had? And I will provide the answer later, but I'm going to leave it there for the moment, and you can figure it out. And we'll see if you get it, but we'll come back to it because this is here for a particular reason. Getting enough food to survive and be able to gather enough to reproduce is one of the fundamental things that all organisms have to do. And so as a behavioral ecologist, that's one of the things that I've been particularly interested in. And I was teaching my advanced ecology class, and I realized I hadn't really done anything about this, trying to figure out what does foraging theory look like, how would you do it? And I made an effort and worked hard on it and came and gave a lecture to my class. And at the end of the lecture, there was a graduate student from another department sitting in the back. And he came down to the front and said, "Gordon, that was terrible." At that point, I was confronted with an inconvenient truth. He was correct. And so I said, okay, let's do better. So he and I and another graduate student from a different department met once a week, working on and developed some stuff on foraging theory. They developed theses, and some of my publications that are still most cited are about that. So I bring personal experience to this as to how hard it was to do this. It wasn't that I was just stupid. At least I prefer that not to be the explanation, but it's genuinely hard. And I sort of feel my talk was probably like a cartoon I saw, because if Newton had been a botanist, and this botanist sitting on the tree and the apple falls on his head, and he says, "Aha, apples are not firmly attached to the tree." Absolutely true, absolutely uninformative. And we all talk about following the facts. The truth is there's an awful lot of facts that aren't worth following. And part of science and training is figure out which ones are worth following. So I'm going to try to do this with respect to foraging theory and developing it. But a first sidestep, how do you do evolutionary testing? We're talking about how this got molded. We're not talking about the future. We're trying to explain the past. What are the processes that led to this thing? Why did we have that as opposed to something else? What were the mechanisms? So we're talking about things that already have happened. And so George Gaylord Simpson, one of the great paleontologists of the last century, said, let's call this post-diction. Not prediction, post-diction, because it's already happened. We're not predicting the future. And almost all testing of evolutionary hypotheses is, in fact, post-diction. We're trying to understand the past. What are the processes why do we have this? Why does the world look like that? And that's the goal of evolutionary biology, to try to understand. And Darwin you go to Darwin, well, why do we have a puffin? And Darwin would say, I don't have a clue. I've given you a mechanism. You figure out what it means. And it's like the rabbi who said he could do the entire Torah standing on one foot. He said, it's the golden rule. Everything else is explication. So we're talking about dealing with testing with evolutionary hypotheses. This is a rather curious and different sort of thing than a lot of testing. And I want to show how this works and explain it to you. But remember that we're post-dicting. It's already happened. We're trying to understand what happened. And so that's the sleuthing. And it's hard. And there's a lot of ways to get misled, and a lot of facts that aren't worth following that we follow up anyway before we figure it out. When I train graduate students, one of the big things I try to get them to figure out is how to know which facts are worth following and which aren't. That's a part of evolution, of development of the scientific mind. And it isn't easy. But before I get into actually testing, I want to have one other diversion, which was really important in figuring out how to think about this. And let's imagine there's a lion and she's going out hunting at night. And it's a she because the females do all the hunting. The males just roar. And, and so the female's out there, and she encounters a warthog. Now, lions, they do attack and eat warthogs. And warthog chops are tasty. But warthog is kind of small. And she's got kittens back there. And there are zebras and wildebeest out there, which are far preferable. And so the lion has to, do I go for this, try to attack this warthog, or do I wait with hope of finding a zebra or a wildebeest, which would be much, much better? How could she make that decision? What would she have to know even to think about that decision? And if the lion comes to you and asks for advice, what would you have to know to tell her something, you know? And so this really turns out to be interesting. And one of the things that it took us a while to figure this out is that any forager, and the female lion in this case, is a Bayesian statistician. And you may not know anything about Bayesian statistics, and that's fine. You don't need to know anything about it. But the point is that in order for her to make a decision, she has to have some sense of what the world is out there. She has to have some, if I don't go and I wait for a zebra or a wildebeest, and I don't find one, I come back with nothing. What's the probability if I let the warthog go and wait for a wildebeest or a zebra? What's the probability that I would find one? How long would I have to? Because if I don't go for that and wait, I come back in the morning with nothing. So the idea of Bayesian statistics is that for any organism, and the good news I'm going to tell you, and don't try this on a cocktail party, but it's good news, you are all Bayesian statisticians. Don't try it on anybody else, but you are. Okay, because we all do it. Every morning we update our priors. I have to do mine every morning now. But anyway, so she has to come with some prior knowledge about what the state of the environment is. And so what a Bayesian statistics involves, that the organism has some sense. This is what it's bringing as the understanding to the situation. And then it gets updated. And so the real question then to the female lion is, what should she do? Well, I saw a zebra last night, or did I? Or the night before? What sort of background information would I have to bring to this to bear? How long of a background set of information should I even try to use? And this turns out to be assessing what the priors are, an important part of evolutionary biology, because if the background is pretty predictable, that's one sort of thing. If it's really an uncertain environment, how long do you wait and what do you use? This turns out to be an exciting part of the development of this sort of theory. But so I just wanted to mention at the beginning, because Bayesian statistics is going to rear its ugly head throughout my talk. And this is important to know, that we can't do any thinking about foraging theory and what organisms ought to do without giving the organism some knowledge, some sense of what the environment is at the moment that it may update. And this is actually what turns out to be testable. So remember that priors, the organism has a certain sense of what the environment is like based on whatever information we think it ought to be there, and it would have been molded by natural selection. But that's a part of the operation, and so that's a background for everything. As Bayesian statistics is going to keep cropping up throughout my talk. So let's go back to actually how we test. So if you're going to test some evolutionary theory, you have to have a guess of what natural selection might have favored. And the first guess, which was an obvious one, and it's turned out to be very good, was natural selection would favor, when an organism is foraging, that it maximizes the amount of energy it gets per unit time. That's a guess on them. And that's a good guess, because foraging is time exclusive. If you're out foraging, you can't do anything else, and the other things to use time for. We also know from everybody who's ever studied birds that there are runts in the nest, and you see that young one ain't going to make it as skinny, and that isn't going to be on the breeding population next year. If they had brought more energy, they might have kept that kid going. So we know that this is a shortage. So getting enough energy per unit time is probably something that natural selection ought to have favored. How do we figure that out, whether that was the case or not? So the way you set this up, and it's sort of crazy. Let's say then we get an array of all the particular prey items that this forager might have looked at, and we look at each one and say and rank it. What is the energy expected if you go for it for the time it takes before you're ready to hunt again? So this is the energy per unit time, and we rank all the prey from the top to the bottom out there, and so we have an array, and we confront the organism, and the answer is rather interesting. The diet is expanded or contracted at the bottom, depending entirely on the abundance of the most favored species. And put simply, if the best item in terms of energy per unit time is really common, it doesn't pay to take anything else. You wait, another one's going to come really fast, and you're going to get your energy maximized by then. But if then say that prey gets less abundant, well, you add something else, and you keep adding, and you add a subtract down, and it's based entirely on the abundance of higher ranked organisms, and that turns out, if you want to maximize it, that's the case. But so let's go imagine this forager out there, and we've given it perfect knowledge about this. It knows what all those prey are and what their value is, and it knows how much time each one takes and all of that. Well, no organism knows that, and you can't ask the organism to go figure that out. It would take forever, and you'd starve in the process of trying to figure it out. So organism can't operate knowing that. But why do you do something so stupid like giving it all that free knowledge? Because you want to find out what would it do if that were true. And you can see how close it gets to it. And that idea has been tested, and it's been tested ingeniously with a bird called the great tit. And the word tit has a different connotation in Britain than it does here. And it was done interesting. You had a conveyor belt, and you could put different, and these are mealworms or pieces of mealworms, and they knew how long it took when a great tit went and picked up a mealworm as well when it was ready to hunt again. So we knew this for each of the things. And so the conveyor belt was coming, and the great tit would start with no priors at all. It didn't have any idea what was coming. But what turns out that they rather quickly figured this out, and that if the big mealworm, and the mealworms are beetle larvae, as you probably know, follower beetle larvae, and they're really good. Birds love them, and they figured out very quickly what the abundance was, and adjusted their diet because they started out sort of picking up everything. But rather quickly they figured this out, and adjusted as though they were obeying the rule, maximized amount of energy you can get per unit time. And they did pretty well, even though they couldn't possibly have had the perfect knowledge we said they had. But so what this has led to is a lot of understanding. Because it really works. They figure it out pretty fast, but they can't be doing what we said they're doing with perfect knowledge because we know they don't have that. So you end up, how close would different rules of thumb get you to it? So they start developing models for if you different rules of thumb, how close do you get? So what might organisms that don't have this complete knowledge that we've given to them free, what will they do? And this turns out to be rather interesting as to how close you can get with different rules of thumb. So this turns out to be an important part of foraging theory. So the bottom line here is that we can set up models that they can be tested as possible to figure out, and it looks like the idea that birds are trying to maximize the amount of energy they get per time foraging looks to be a pretty good predictor of how they behave, and they do the best with this sort of thing. So this is just one example. It was a rather ingenious test, and the birds did better than I thought they would. But I've always felt, birds are pretty good at being birds. When someone tells you you're a bird brain, take it as a compliment, because so that's one test. But let's continue with this a little bit. The bird there is doing this, and things are getting worse. Maybe it's depleted the prey or something like this. Well, there's other places in the world out there. Should it move to try to find some other place that may be better? And again, we're confronted with the Bayesian statistical problem. It has to have some idea what the world is like out there, what other patches. If it leaves the patches in and goes to another patch, how likely is it to find another patch? And so again, we have the organism, in order to make any decision, should I leave the patch I'm in now and go somewhere else? It has to have some prior estimate of what the world is like out there. Because I'm going to leave my patch and there ain't nothing out there. That's not such a good thing. Stick with it is, even though it ain't so good anymore. So we start looking at the real world out there, which is a patchy environment. And if things are getting bad where you are, you don't have to stay where you are. But how would you decide when to leave where you are? What's the likelihood you're going to find another patch? And again, the bird or any forager has to have in its mind some sense. This is what the environment is like out there now. This is the probability that I will find something better if I move. And again, it's operating with Bayesian statistics. It can't make a decision about whether to move or not without having some prior assessment of what the world is like out there. So in all of these foraging things, and I told you it's going to keep cropping up, it's impossible to even make models and to think about organisms make these decisions without the organism have some sense about what the environment is out there. And this can be, in the case of the great tips of the thing, no priors, immediate adjustment. But in reality, there's going to be evolutionary adjustments. And there's going to be adjustment based on what the experience of the organism has been in the environment recently. It has updated, and it's got a sense. In my experience, this is what the environment is like now. This is how likely, if I don't go after the warthog, I'm going to get a zebra. So you can't think about foraging theory without giving the organism having some sense of what the environment's like. And if I do this, what's the chance that I improve my situation than if I don't do it? And figuring out what the priors are, and basically if the environment is pretty stable, the period of time that did I see a zebra last week or yesterday, but if it's very, very uncertain, the length of time over which the organism might be integrating, and figuring out what the priors and how you set the priors turns out to be an interesting part of foraging theory, which I'm not going to go into now because it leads us into the weeds, but you get the idea as to why you can't make any theory or test anything unless the organisms are operating with some prior assessment of what the world is like at the moment it's having to make a decision. And it gets, and they can be updated pretty fast, as the great tips did. They're really amazingly fast. They figured this out. It may not be easy so fast, but that's the fundamental thing, and it turns out to make any kind of predictions or any sort of tests, we have to give the organism some prior assessment This is what it thinks about the environment that it's in now, and what happens if I do this or that. So that's why it turns out it took us a while to figure this out, that the organisms had to be Bayesian statisticians. And in order to do anything, you had to allow it to do some stuff. So and that goes on to a lot of other things there. Let's leave that one and come back to our puffin. Okay? And I left you with a question. So the puffin, this is an example of what we call central place foraging. As I mentioned, this is a different thing, and it's interesting because the unit in central place foraging is a round trip, right? There's the trip out, there's the foraging part and the trip back, and food is gathered only in one of the three phases. No food is gathered on the trip out and the trip back. So, we're going out. And one of the things that is immediately obvious qualitatively, you don't need any advanced mathematical knowledge. Closer is better. The closer you can find the prey, the shorter the trip, the better it's going to be. And so we see this a lot in the location of colonies of breeding seabirds where you're packed right in there. And one of the places, they're almost always where there's a strong current. And it brings new prey all the time. You cannot deplete it because the water mass tomorrow is not the water mass you had today. And so if you look at the location of where big seabird colonies are, that is often one of the, there's a strong current, which means the water you're sampling tomorrow is not the water you looked at today. And so you can't really deplete it. Another way that happens, like the murres that are common on the coast here in the big colonies, the little ones, when they're still kind of pretty tiny, they jump off the cliff into the water. The adult takes them, off they go with the adult, and they take the prey with them, so there's no round trip anymore. They can move and do that. And that's, but one other solution to this is to, how do we maximize what I can get during that foraging period, okay? Now, if we have a long, thin bill, like a tern, the first prey you get, that's it. You can't put that anywhere and get another one. And so then the tern out there, which has a long, thin bill, then it's just like we've been talking about. What is that like when I look at, this is the first fish, am I going to get a bigger one? Because I know the first one I take is going to be it. I can't add anything to it. So then it becomes just like we've been talking about. What's the assessment out there? If there's a fish, okay, what's the likelihood if I don't go after it, I get a bigger fish? Because fish number one stops it. And I got, whenever I get the first fish, I got to come back with it. But obviously, that's not the problem that the puffin has. And that's the secret of that bill. You have that fat bill. It's possible, and the mechanics have been worked out. You can put something back there, and you can still get something else. And this tells you it works. The puffin has in fact done it. And so what determines the limit? And it's probably the likelihood, if you got two already, it may be more difficult to hold two and get the third. So the likelihood that, oh, I should have quit because now I dropped them all, sort of thing, means that the evolution of this bill, this fat bill, it allows you, and the mechanics have been worked out, to in fact stuff one back and catch something and not lose that one. And that's what the puffin bill is all about. And all the fancy stuff we see, given a big bill like that, that's great to use it as a display, show it off, and that's what the puffin does with this. But you should look at what the puffin looks like in the fall and the winter. You wouldn't recognize any of this. And if you haven't ever looked at, I've got one here with the page marked what the puffin looks like in the non-breeding season. But you probably have a bird guide, and if you're interested, go look it up. You won't recognize it. It doesn't look like a puffin. It's got a kind of funny thing there, but nothing like this. So it has taken it. Bills can be changed a lot and all sorts of stuff done. And this bill undergoes amazing transformation as breeding season comes out. It does, and we also know you can do that with feathers, right? You can change the feathers. That's a big deal. But you can also do it with bills. And there's a lot of changing in colors and shapes of bills. And if you look at the other alcids, the oxmers and puffins, a lot of them do things with their bills in the breeding season. We got one out here called the rhinoceros auklet. What happens? In the breeding season, it does a big thing on the bill. That's why it's called rhinoceros. That's not on the bill in the fall and the winter. And if you look at other alcids, you see that a lot is done. And even if you watch the gulls out here now, they're coming into breeding plumage. And one of the things that we'll see that happen if you look closely, they develop a bright red patch at the tip of the bill. It's not there now. You'll see it in the spring. And that's the little thing that the chicks peck at. That's the guide to the first chick. The chicks peck at it. But that's a color that they pick up in the spring, in the breeding season, and then they drop it. So birds' bills are pretty fascinating. And there's a lot you can do with the bill. This is the most spectacular thing you can do with the bill, which is why I chose it and why you all know that puffin bill. There's almost nobody that doesn't know what a puffin looks like in the spring because it's such a wonderful thing. But this is a bill. Then it enhances in the spring. They do also stuff with it, and it's a courtship device and other things. But the reason the puffin had that to do with natural selection was favoring a fat bill. You can stuff one or two back there and still get the third. And that's what this is all about. Another way they can stop it, some of the bigger birds, you eat it and come back and regurgitate it. And that's then how big a gut have you got to. But then there's also a limit. You're storing it there and it's hot. You start digesting it. Right? If you take too long, there ain't much value left anymore because you've digested it. And so this can set a limit for things that are going to come back and regurgitate. That sets the time of how long you ought to go out there. So looking at central place foraging and how you maximize what you get during that one phase that you're getting food turns out to be really interesting, and it has implications for what the changes in breeding plumage is, the structure of the bills, where bird colonies are, all of that stuff. That's all related. And again, it seems to be based upon following the notion that maximizing the amount of energy you can get in unit time of foraging is what's driving it. And this seems to be working so well generally because energy is critical, and foraging, you can't do anything when you're out hunting. You can't do anything else. I mean, the time is just simply not shareable. So that's an important part of understanding this. So we've made an awful lot of mileage by understanding, just using one predictor, namely energy maximization while foraging, and that turns out to have but that's not everything. And let me just give you one diversion here that will emphasize how different it can be. I've been talking about animals that are eating other animals. But there's a lot of animals that eat plants. Okay? And the question is not to pursue or not, but to bite or not. Okay? And this is also interesting because when you look about animals eating plants, which a lot of animals do, I haven't talked about, but this we've got to have some optimal foraging for them too, right? And it's also very interesting because mostly they're very tiny. The insects are tiny. Very seldom does the prey get killed. It survives. And it can do things to get tougher. And we have what goes on with that is the plants develop defensive chemistry, and it can, different sort of kinds, and it can be changed. And plants, when they've been attacked, are able to change and up the defensive in other parts of the plant, because the herbivore isn't going to be killing you. You've got a chance to do something on the other branch because it hasn't been attacked yet. And this is my basic belief that all the origin of so-called talking trees and everything else, they're not talking to different trees, they're talking to different parts of where they are. That's a long story, but we'll leave that one for later. But so there's a great big area of foraging theory that I haven't talked about, and that is animals eating plants. And here's an interesting evolutionary quirk, a story. Animals evolved very complicated systems in the ocean. And if we look at how the period of geological history when everything was in the sea, it's all called zoic animals, right? Because what you have in the fossils are animal remains. There's no plant remains. Why? Because all the plants where there were simple algae, simple little cells that didn't do anything. And even the great kelp that we got there, that's just a chain of individual cells, each of which is self-sufficient, bathed, and there's no conducting system, there's no roots, there's nothing like that in those. Each cell is an individual thing that gets everything it wants. And when the photosynthetic organisms that were mostly very, very simple in the ocean, every cell was bathed in everything it needed. It got everything from its immediate environment. So when plants colonized the land, they started with nothing. And so everything that plants have built on land has been built after they got to land. And the fact that now the plant is confronted with gravity, which it wasn't a problem before in the water. It's also the fact that it's got to get resources in different, now it gets some resources, carbon dioxide and sunlight from the air. All the other stuff, the water and all the nutrients it gets from the soil. So it's got to develop all of this. And so plants have developed a very complicated chemistry for all of this. But one of the things as it developed all of this, it didn't pick up any use of sodium, no salts, because salt is scarce on land. So we look at the basis for all the chemistry. Sodium isn't involved. Now animals evolved their nervous system in the ocean, which happens to have a lot of sodium. And the basis of the way the nervous system is functions in animals is a sodium pump. If you learned anything about physiology, you learn about the sodium pump. So animals need sodium, and we picked up almost certainly sodium was involved in because it evolved in a very sodium-rich environment. There's sodium all over the place. So then animals come on land, and we're already very complicated, but we brought our marine evolved nervous system that wants sodium, needs sodium. Plants don't need sodium, they don't have it. And I'll just leave it with you, one of the most striking things about human history is the power and the role for looking for salt. And Michael Kurlansky has a wonderful book just called Salt. And there's another companion one just called Cod. But salt has had an absolutely amazing role in human history. And why is it so important? Why do we fight wars over salt and everything? Because we need salt, and particularly if you're an herbivore, getting salt is a real problem. If you want to catch a deer, then I put up a salt lick and sit. You know, they're going to come. And so it turns out that getting enough salt turns out to be a big problem for herbivores. And they crave it and do also. You see the moose going to that water in the summer? That's awful stuff. It's all water. You wouldn't want to eat that. That's really bad. But some of that those platycans have salt. The moose going into the water there is picking up its annual supply of sodium. Because the other stuff it's going to eat doesn't have any sodium. The moose is going to be in big trouble. So as we talk about animals that eat plants, it turns out that chemistry turns out to be an enormous thing. And because of the evolutionary history of our nervous system, salt is an amazing thing. We fight wars over it and we do all this stuff. And I've tried to explain to you there's a little interesting evolutionary history of why salt is so important, and why we fight wars over it, and all these sorts of things. So that's a little diversion into the fact that I talked about foraging theory. Well, there was a huge area of foraging theory, animals eating plants, that I didn't touch at all. And I've given you just a little sampling to show how different that world is. It's totally different. And we're into biochemistry and all sorts of stuff, into plants' defensive chemistry, because once the lion catches the zebra, there's no chance to make any evolutionary or metabolic adjustment. The plant can up its defenses, and they do. So this is an entirely different world, and it's an exciting world. But when we talk about that aspect of foraging theory, it's really quite different. And that's another set of talks, very different. I won't go any further, but to let you know that, again, the whole point of this is for any theory, you have to know what's the domain of applicability. How much does it apply for? The central place foraging theory has a limited application. It's when birds are going out, when insects are going, whenever you're coming back and storing and taking back to a central place. That's a rather limited part of nature. It happens to be one that we were really interested in, and we did a lot with it, but it's narrow application. So it's always important to know what is the zone of applicability of any theory. And we don't, for foraging theory, we don't have the foraging theory of everything, and we never will. And to think you might find that, don't do it, because it ain't there. But knowing what the domain of applicability is. So I've tried to explain to you that looking at evolutionary explanations like I've given to you has some interesting quirks. And we're not trying to predict the future, we're in post-diction. And there was the quote, the hardest thing about the Soviet Union is to predict the past. Well, it turns out that one of the hardest things to predict about the United States is the past. But it's hard. We're trying to figure out the past now. We do all these models, and how natural selection would have worked to produce the kind of world we have. Why we have puffins that do this. Why we have lions that chase zebras and behave that way. We're trying to explain it, and the answer is in the past, and we're trying to guess the past. And this is post-diction. It gives these evolutionary hypotheses an interesting, it's still basic science, but you got to remember, it's somewhat different than asking, what's carbon dioxide going to do to the climate? Which is a very, very different sort of question and a different way of looking at it. So understanding what post-diction and what this is like is really an important thing. So get the difference, and I hope I've given you some understanding of that. So I hope With this, I've given you some ability to understand how you do evolutionary hypothesis testing and why it's got quirks. Why the good news is you're all Bayesian statisticians, and even though you didn't know it, and why the zone of applicability is important. So, but I hope I've conveyed some of these to you. But the most important thing of all that I hope you remember, above all, I hope you'll never look at a puffin again the same way. And enjoy lunch.
Okay. Gordon, thank you so much for this interesting understanding. For me, I can relate it to my own journey in life, leaving Buffalo because of the terrible storms that they had there, winters there had there each year, and deciding I think there was something better, and my frustration with my family that they didn't come with me. They let me go by myself, and I did find a better place and a better life. So that was very fascinating. I missed, though, please forgive me, because I think I missed, what was it about how did the puffin keep all those fish in their jaw?
It's the shape of the bill.
Just because of the shape?
The shape of the bill that allows you to stuff something in the back and still be able to pinch it in the front. Whereas a long, thin bill, you can't do that. So the whole point is that's why the puffin's got this big fat bill.
But it didn't fall out when it opened. That's
well, you can hold
fascinating.
I know it's a little hard to understand, but the mechanics of this have been worked out.
Okay.
Obviously, puffins are doing it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we know that it's possible.
That's right.
That's the first rule of what exists is possible.
Right. What exists is possible. Thank you. Well, we're going to have questions, I'm sure, from our audience. Joyce.
Is it kind of a dumb question, but is it possible there's kind of a bit of a tongue inside that bill that would hold things back?
Yes, there is something to help it. But even if you have a long, thin bill, nothing you can do will solve it.
Well, hold it. Right. Mm-hmm. Okay. Kurt Mackey has a question. How do you narrow down the variables to be sure about foraging behaviors? How do you narrow down the variables to be so sure about the foraging behaviors?
Well, what you do is you make some guesses.
Mm-hmm.
And so much of what I developed was based on a particular guess. And that seems for a lot of foraging, that turns out to be pretty good, because when you're foraging, you can't do anything else. And so time is indivisible. And so there's other uses of time that are valuable. So that's why that one has worked so well in so many cases. But it was a guess, but I think it was an informed guess. And what science is a lot of guesses, and some of them are not so well informed, and we throw them out. And science makes a lot of mistakes, but when we're doing something what we don't understand yet, we make guesses. Mm-hmm. And we try to rationalize, this is why we think this is a good guess. But then it may or may not be a good guess, but it turns out that maximizing the amount of energy per unit time foraging turns out to have been a very, very good guess. And it makes sense. But as I pointed out, for other stuff, that's not the guess. And so, again, that was my point, that you need to know what is the domain over which this thing works. And the central place foraging has a very limited domain. Social insects and birds feeding babies, and that's sort of it. So that doesn't make it uninteresting, because there's a lot of world in that, but that's the domain, and beyond that it has no meaning. Did I get your question?
Kurt, did that answer your question? There he is. Yeah, I think, Kurt, if you unmute, you could, Gordon was wanting to make sure he
Yeah,
answered.
yeah, that's great. It's uh, you explained it. Yeah, it's kind of foraging is a kind of a narrow in itself as a restricted behavior. So I guess you can guess pretty much around that based on that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Questioner number 2. Al, come on.
I think my question is very similar to the previous one. It seems like you're trying to predict what the rules were in an environment that you didn't see. And so you can hypothesize about the rules, or you can hypothesize about the environment. And it's so many variables that there must be just a lot of spectacular failures in this where, oh, somebody thinks they've got it all figured out, and then they find out something else about the environment and they figure out that they were all wrong. This is very much like what the physicists are trying to do to resolve the Hubble tension. You know, what are the rules of the universe, and what did it look like umpteen billion years ago? Can you give us any examples of spectacular failures in this kind of logic?
Well, science is full of a lot of spectacular failures, okay? Which is why there's so much public understanding of what's going on, because we're trying to explain things we don't understand, and we make these guesses, and they're based on particular understanding of physical laws and other stuff. So it's interesting. I read that for the people who got the Nobel Prizes, how often it was true that the study and the advance for which they got the Nobel Prize, they had trouble getting published back then. And
Wow.
and so when science is at the frontier, we're guessing about things we don't know. And the most important answer a scientist can ever give to something is, I don't know.
Yeah. And it's
That's the beginning of wisdom. I don't know. And the problem with other ways of supposedly knowing what happens is you never say, I don't know. We find another way to make sure I know. And that's the big thing. But science is full of mistakes. It's a form of human behavior, and we're making guesses. And I give you an example of a guess that turned out to be pretty good, maximizing energy.
Mhm.
But we had some particular reason. We had a lot of background knowledge that said this might be kind of important, you know.
Right.
It was not a bad guess. And I would have been surprised, actually, if it had been way off the mark.
But Gordon, it took
You
you,
don't always guess right, but that's it.
but it took a student to look at you and say, you got this all wrong.
I hadn't understood. I mean, I had worked on it, and I don't know what my lecture was. I've never, and I don't want to know what was there because it's awful. But it took a while to understand
Right.
that you had to think of the forager as a Bayesian statistician. Until we figured that out, we didn't know what to do. And
Right.
this is an example. You don't know how to go after something. Let me just give another example of a field in which I've had something to do with. There was a British geographer, J. Appleton, that was interested in studying landscape, and he was working. How do I think about landscape? What hypotheses do I have about landscape? And he was stymied. So he was on vacation in the English Lake District, and was at a friend's cottage, and a little book was on the night table next to the bed. And it was Konrad Lorenz's King Solomon's Ring. And he was reading it, and there's a little passage in which Lorenz is walking through the woods in the spring and everything wonderful, and he comes to a glade, looks out at what's out there, and he says, how wonderful to see without being seen. And J. Appleton said, that's it. That's the idea of it. And that just exploded with the development of landscape theory and other stuff. But it took the idea, and he got it in a strange way, but
Yeah. He had to have insight.
See,
Thank you, Gordon. Questioner number 3.
I know that's a deviation, but it's interesting.
It is interesting. Question.
I'm one that is a little cautious about attributing too much to animals other than humans. And I would say that the lioness could just smell if there were animals that would be more conducive to going after, as opposed to the warthog, as opposed to having a broader understanding of the environment. Would you go along with that?
Well, I haven't made this clear, but nothing that the animal understands what it's doing. That, you know, the lion is, oh, I got to think this out, because I think probably most of it is not of the result of direct understanding. That natural selection mode stuff, and most of what's going on in my brain, I don't know what's going on there, and they won't let me know what's going on, and I try to get into it, and it tells me no. So that I should have made this clear, that none of what I have said assumes that the animal has a cognitive understanding of why it's making those decisions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Gordon. Questioner number 4. Please.
In the course of your research, did you find any specific species or situations that either were a counterexample or looked like a counterexample to the maximizing energy per unit time, and either gave you more nuance to what you already knew, or just somehow expanded the scope of what you're doing?
Well, that's why I brought in the herbivores, because that's very, very different. And when we're talking about animals eating animal tissues, which is what I was talking about, animals eating other animals, sodium isn't a problem. A lion gets all the sodium it needs eating zebras, and you and I get all the sodium we need if we eat animal stuff. If we don't eat any animals and just eating plants, we better get sodium. But you know, it's how do I say this? But there are many examples, which is why I brought in the whole herbivore thing, is because that's a very different calculus. And again, it doesn't assume that any of these animals doing what they're doing, that they have a cognitive awareness and say, I know why I'm doing this. I understand this. Because I think that's probably not true. I can't prove it, but I would really, so much of what I think I know why I'm doing it, I don't. So I think birds are probably about the same way I am. You know, they're doing the right thing and they don't know why.
Thank you, Gordon. How about questioner number 5 here at front? Please.
Hi. Humans foraging or hunting use culture as what to kill or not to kill. Like, you shouldn't eat pigs or shellfish. This is not a good idea. Do the prides of lions share culture within their own, so that they say, don't go after the water buffalo, that's just too big? So I was just wondering if there's a cultural aspect to this too.
Well, for human beings, it's massively cultural, because we're involved in, and we became predators that you couldn't capture these prey by yourself. It involved a lot of very social activities, and that's probably one of the selection factors for increased cranial capacity, for ability to organize and work the stuff together, because human beings are ending up going after a lot of stuff that if you tried to go out as a single individual, you wouldn't do very well. So I think the whole social structure and socializing ability to cooperate and to work together, I think has been absolutely critical in the evolution of human foraging, because we went through a phase when we were mostly eating big mammals, and that you don't go after a buffalo on your own. You know, I mean, right. if you want to come back with food and feeling well.
Thank you, Gordon. How about questioner number 6?
Yes. There's a lot of theologians and ministers, Thomas Bayes being one of them, that do you have any thoughts about why there's so much of them? Is it time on their hands? Is there observational proclivities? There's a lot of people that didn't realize they were supporting, science and secular, understanding probably more than, God. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, once we developed our big brain and had the capacity, we asked the question, what does life mean? What's death? And as far as I know, no other animal has any idea what death means or cares about it. So this is a byproduct of the big brain, which is rather unfortunate because we get a lot of worried about it. But once you develop this mental capacity, you want to try to understand what does it all mean and why am I here and all of that. And obviously, people had no way of answering that kind of question. So they invented answers, which were probably better than not having anything at all, because once you have a view that God is controlling the climate and the chariots are going across, once you have an agent out there, you can cut deals. And so whenever there's agency, you have an opportunity to cut deals. Natural selection offers no deals, absolutely nothing. So I think I see a lot of the development of the religious beliefs, since everybody thought everything was controlled by one sort of God or another, and you had a lot of gods and they had different portfolios. And what has happened, of course, with Christianity, you pulled it down and you end up with only one God that has the full portfolio. And then you could get great big wins by appeasing him. And the Catholic Church, of course, made really business out of it. We can give you the hotline, but here's the price.
Very good. Questioner number 7 here at Friendly House.
That's me.
Okay, Dave.
So since you did your work, there's been a lot of work on artificial intelligence, which has kind of come up with a model of what is going on in our brains. And this idea of this Bayesian background or model of the world is these days might be thought of as the connections between the neurons in our brain that have been formed from our experience. I was wondering if you have kind of thought about your work in the perspective of the newer kind of thoughts about what's going on in there. And it does seem to be an interesting question as to whether how much of that model of the world is inherited from one generation to another, and how much of it is formed anew, and how malleable it is depending on a new environment that an organism might enter versus something like that.
Okay.
And really, it's where do the priors come from? That's the fundamental question. And I said almost nothing about that because this is an extremely complicated thing. Some of the priors are they've got to be evolutionarily determined. Natural selection has to have given us a lot of priors, but of course, they're not all present at birth. The priors of evolutionary priors change with age too, as a result of just maturation of the nervous system, and then the priors are updated by actual experience. So the origin of priors is an absolutely fascinating topic about which, unfortunately, I said almost nothing. And that's because I know almost nothing about it.
Good for you. You know, Gordon, it is really hard to say I don't know, especially if grant funds are depending on it and things like that. So good for you. Good for you.
as I said, the most important thing a scientist can say,
Right.
I don't know.
Question.
That's the opening of discovery.
That's right. You're absolutely right. We are down to the last few minutes of our program, so we've got a few more questions, and so I'm going to ask folks to really just ask your questions so we all can be included. Question number 8. Go ahead.
So I live as a vegan, and I am consciously aware that I get to have the luxury of existing as a herbivore as an ethical choice because of the cooperation of humans around me. And so I feel like I am outside of the example of the puffin. However, in your description, what seemed familiar to me was this Bayesian idea of making choices based on what we're aware of. And so in that way, I and humans who have a more normative omnivore diet are like the puffin because we only choose what we think is available to us. And that seemed really interesting to me. So my question is the humanist point of your presentation today, is that about how we as humans, we kind of share this human condition, as I would call it, with the puffin? And so does that sum up your message on a humanist level, or is there more you would say about that?
This is I get the question, but it's hard. It's hard, because we end up making all sorts of ethical decisions, which you obviously have made, and that relates to, in part, because we have an evolutionary understanding of our relationships to other things, and what people will and won't eat is a remarkable variable. There are people that won't eat mammals, but will eat everything else. Ones that will eat mammals, won't eat mammals and birds, but will happy to eat fish. Those are ones that won't eat anything but any vertebrates at all, but are very happy to eat clams and mussels. So the full spectrum. And this sort of decision relates more to the kind of sense that as individuals we develop with our relationship to the rest of the biological world and how we want to interact with it. And I think any of those decisions those are personal decisions that I respect, but I don't know. I'm not giving you a very good answer to this.
It's a hard question.
But it's a tough one.
It is. Thank you, Gordon. We've got questioner number 9.
I might be another version of a question you've already answered, Gordon, but humans are willing to take risks. And there may be, the precedent may be that everybody who went out and tried to explore that place before died because they never came back. And yet we're still curious. Is curiosity part of that difference that you're talking about, that animals don't have it?
No. I think it's true that curiosity sometimes kills cats.
Mm-hmm.
Cats that aren't curious don't learn anything and don't survive very well. So curiosity is, I think all animals have it, and they're exploring, and a lot of individuals die because of it. The birds I've studied, the small birds like red-winged blackbirds, have about a 50% mortality every year. And so the vast number of them don't ever reach year 1. Most of them breed only once or less. So there's an enormous mortality out there. And part of it is due to curiosity, but most of it is due to just environment throws a lot of stuff at you. So that I'm not answering this very well, but I think curiosity is a fundamental thing in almost all organisms, because without it, you don't try something.
Right.
You don't try.
Right. Is there a question number 10? Okay. Leslie has one. Oh, no. Question number 10?
I'll volunteer.
My understanding with global warming, current changes, warming of the sea, that birds and penguins and whatever are having to forage further, and they're not making the round trip successfully or even making it. And I'm wondering if evolution, or if their way of adapting is gonna save any of those species. Do you have any idea about that?
Well, what you're describing is true. And the question is, how much of can the animal accommodate for this by making behavioral adjustments in time? And how much of it that you cannot do that way, that you're just going to pay the price. And unfortunately, for the most part, natural selection is kind of slow. You don't get it immediately. And so what organisms can accomplish by learning and adjusting, because maybe you can go out further, but that increases the travel time. And penguins in Argentina, where a colleague of mine working, they got to go further and further as it gets warmer, and they're swallowing the food and bringing it back and regurgitating. But they got the problem I did mention. You go a little further, and it's in the warm gut, and they're digesting it, and so you can't solve the problem by going out further, because you end up not having much to come back with. So that there are limits. Some of it can be adjusted behaviorally, and I think a lot of it is simply beyond what behavioral adjustment can do. It's going to require natural selection, which unfortunately is usually rather slow.
Thank you, Gordon, so much. We really wanted to say just a sincere thank you for answering all our questions and for your information. And thank you for all your life's work. And you've done so much, much appreciated. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Well, I enjoy with you people. You're fun.